From poem to rebellion, the mythologizing of William Wallace. All right, let's just dive right into this fascinating journey of how medieval knight became the ultimate political weapon. Today, we're unpacking the sheer mechanics of propaganda. We're going to see exactly how the legend of Sir William Wallace was constructed, reshaped, and essentially weaponized over the course of centuries to fuel an entirely different rebellion.
So I want to kick things off with a bit of a riddle. How exactly does a 15th century poem end up sparking an 18th century war? Because today, we are exploring the multi-century life cycle of a political myth. The William Wallace you might picture in your head, the superhuman patriot, actually owes his iconic status not just to his 13th century deeds, but to a blind minstrel writing nearly 200 years later, and then to a group of 18th century rebels who desperately needed a hero to justify their own cause. To make sense of all this, we're going to trace a 500-year evolution. From Wallace's execution in 1305 to Blind Harry's Poetic Exaggeration in the 1470s, right up to the 1745 Jacobite Rising, and finally to 1822, where that dangerous rebellion was repackaged into Walter Scott's romantic pageantry.
Section 1, The Origin of the Blueprint. Let's step back in time and meet the real architect of our myth, the 15th century minstrel known as Blind Harry.
It's absolutely wild when you compare the historical Wallace with Blind Harry's version. The real Wallace was a lesser noble fighting a gritty, asymmetrical guerrilla war. But Blind Harry's Wallace, the one from his epic 11,000-line poem, that fabricated version is essentially a medieval superhero. I mean, Harry literally wrote that Wallace was so strong he could slay 15 Englishmen with a single bow. It's pure action movie logic. Harry purposely, and I mean heavily, exaggerated these traits to create the ultimate archetype. He gave Wallace superhuman physical strength, elevated his noble origins, and painted him as this uncompromising defender of sovereignty fueled by personal vengeance and honest poverty. And why do this? Well, it was a direct critique of his own 15th century king's pro-English policies. Harry was using a ghost from the past to establish a fierce, anti-usurper blueprint for his present. It's a literal masterclass in early propaganda. Section 2, Echoes of Usurpation. The crucial point we really need to grasp here is how this exact 15th century poem became the ideological blueprint for the 18th century Jacobites. The Jacobites, who desperately wanted to restore the exiled Stuart monarchy, literally copy-pasted the Wallace narrative onto their own struggle. It's like a perfect mirror. They seamlessly mapped their modern Hanoverian enemies, Kings George II, flawlessly onto Wallace's medieval Plantagenet enemies like Edward I. Both were framed as illegitimate, foreign usurpers trying to destroy Scottish sovereignty. The Jacobites essentially cast their own leader, Bonnie Prince Charlie, as Wallace's direct spiritual successor. And this wasn't just some casual political spin, It was a deeply held conviction. Actually, dying Jacobites like Thomas Deacon echoed this right on the scaffold. Just listen to his words. He contrasts the paternal and tender affection of his rightful king with the rashness of the usurper and his great regard to his German dominions. That is pure, unadulterated Wallace rhetoric, completely rebooted for an 18th century audience, to frame the Hanoverians as Saxon invaders. Now, to really get this, we have to talk about cultural Jacobitism. This was a philosophical and cultural movement that linked Scottish patriotism, indigeneity, and the rugged Gaelic landscape directly to the Stuart cause. It wasn't just about simple regime change. This philosophy existed long before the political movement and really gave the rebellion its soul. Section 3, Weaponizing the Highlander. Building on that profound cultural foundation, the Jacobites needed a physical, intimidating embodiment of their movement. So they actively engineered this incredible identity, the Jacobite Highlander. They rejected the English Union and its perceived moral decay. They embraced the pride of honest poverty, and they adopted Highland dress and the broadsword to display this fierce, uncompromising martial patriotism. They essentially took Blind Harry's Wallace and wore him as a military uniform. And this identity was incredibly potent. The idealized Jacobite Highlander was seen as a staunchly patriotic man. Someone who completely rejected financial corruption, relying instead on raw physical exertion and military prowess to serve his king and country. It was the ultimate, uncompromising symbol of manliness and patriotism wrapped into one. In man, this commitment carried all the way to the chopping block. You have figures like Lord Balmerino actually donning a tartan cap right before his execution just to explicitly declare he died a Scotsman. Or Lord Lovat demanding a traditional Gaelic funeral song. Even in death, they were performing this fierce, independent identity they had built. The propaganda was so wildly successful that even English and lowland Jacobite recruits were routinely labeled as Highlanders by people at the time. The whole aesthetic of the fierce, sword-wielding, tartan-clad warrior had totally eclipsed the reality of who was actually on the battlefield fighting.
Section 4. The Romantic Sanitization. But, as you might know, things took a dark and deeply ironic turn after the bloody defeat at the Battle of Culloden in 1746.
To survive in the new British reality, that dangerous political ideology had to be completely neutralized. A unified state just cannot tolerate a roaming myth of radical rebellion. So the teeth were pulled from the legend. The radical, anti-union threat was basically surgically removed, leaving behind nothing but a safe, nostalgic cultural aesthetic.
The guy most responsible for this massive shift? The legendary writer Sir Walter Scott. In his novel Waverley, he literally wrote that this race had almost entirely vanished from the land, and with it, doubtless, much absurd political prejudice. Scott took a movement of violent, regime-changing rebellion and just rebranded it into a harmless, tragic romance. He made it completely safe to look back on.
By doing this, Romanticism totally depoliticized the Jacobite cause. It transformed a real, terrifying rebellion into a museum of history. It exoticized Highland life as primitively passionate, and it cemented the tartan as a safe, unthreatening emblem of national identity. Suddenly, Scots could feel fierce national pride while remaining perfectly loyal, productive citizens of the British Empire.
Which brings us to what has to be the ultimate historical irony. In 1822, King George IV visits Scotland for a huge pageant organized by Sir Walter Scott himself. And what is the king wearing? A kilt. The Hanoverian monarchy, the literal institution the Jacobites had bled and died trying to destroy, was now cosplaying in the very symbols of that rebellion to prove their own legitimacy over Scotland. No way, right?
So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. When we picture the fierce, tartan-clad Scottish warrior fighting for freedom, whether it's William Wallace or a Jacobite Highlander, are we remembering the gritty reality of history, or are we simply remembering the powerful, calculated poetry that first weaponized it and then safely sanitized it? It's definitely something to think about the next time you see a tartan on display. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.